Welcome to the video, Therapeutic Wizards and Altered States, Supershrinks and Constructionism. My name is Dr. Stephen Bacon. I'm a clinical psychologist in Santa Barbara, California, and I've spent the past decade writing books and researching exactly how psychotherapy works. Therapeutic Wizards. All therapists have heard of the supershrinks, the therapeutic wizards that somehow seem to regularly transform clients, both profoundly and quickly. We have all wondered if they are really as good as they seem. Even more, we wonder if we have the capacity to join their ranks. While constructionism, with its understanding of the fluidity of reality and psychopathology, appears to be a path towards this type of achievement, it's important to note that most of the wizards were not formal constructionists, and some probably never even heard of constructionism. That said, constructionism does have the capacity to explain how they work and how their achievements might be replicated. This explanation begins with the understanding of the nature of constructed reality and the definition of altered state. Constructed reality. The simplified view of pragmatic constructionism divides the world into natural reality and constructed reality using common sense criteria, such as what is stable versus variable across cultures, and what is created constructed versus discovered. As discussed earlier, one of the most striking features of human culture is that concepts that are socially constructed, endorsed by all members of a culture, seem just as real to culture members as objects from the natural world. The definition of honor or truth or duty can be as real as the solidity of a table, a horse, or gravity. The constructionist therapist lives at the intersection of these two worlds and focuses on deprogramming socially constructed objects, thereby achieving a sense of fluidity and mobility. Fluidity versus stability. While the natural world contains its own order, constructed reality is essentially undifferentiated and chaotic. Each culture stabilizes this chaos as they form their own unique cultural reality. Then they initiate their members into this reality. Belonging as a human implies you can see the same cultural reality as your peers. Thinking of the enormous variability of different cultures lets us understand the essential fluidity of constructed reality. This kind of perspective reveals that in constructed reality, the problem isn't the difficulty of change, it is the difficulty of stability. Think of a hillside with a new road cut. The road crews lay down an anti-erosion net because they know that the next heavy rain will change the dirt back into a fluid state. It requires a net to keep its current shape and form. The nomological net. Cultures stabilize the fluidity of constructed reality by a nomological net, where nomos implies order and stability. Put another way, they constrain the mobility of constructed reality via 1,000 strands of meaning and belief that bind a culture's constructions to each other and to every cultural member. Each person is connected by a strand to everything in their life. One strand to money, another to their body, another to their friends, and so on. The strands are nomological in that they include meaning and value judgments. In that sense, the strand of my money also includes value judgments such as rich or poor, and the one to my body includes attractive or ugly. The strands also go into the past and the future, so that I am connected to my history and my possible future. There are value judgments and meanings in each of these strands as well. Nothing is static. Memories change every time we examine them. The future changes with each new moment, and our connections to everything around is in constant flux. The culture, people, and things around us are not static but push back, and in their dialogue with us, reality shifts. Many of these strands and relationships are conscious, but many more are unconscious. Metaphors for constructed reality. It is interesting to compare this net analogy to the story analogy used by narrative therapy. In the story metaphor, there is an emphasis on creative writing and authorship. These are helpful ideas in that they emphasize the fluidity of the story, and the importance of owning one's story. Do I write my own story, or is it authored by others? Conversely, with the net analogy, the emphasis is on the stability, instability of shared and personal reality and the way it is all connected. A net holds things in place that are inherently unstable. When the net is relaxed, broken, or pierced, things become fluid by their own nature. Hence the importance of the last video on deconstruction. Deprogramming opens the door to change. The narrative metaphor is particularly useful for clients in that it emphasizes personal power and authorship. The net metaphor is more helpful for therapists who are attempting to see everything as potentially mobile, and for those emphasizing connection and interdependence. There's a useful and interesting quote from Buddhist teacher Sri Nisargadatta, who also uses the metaphor of the net. The real world is beyond our thoughts and ideas. We see it through the net of our desires, divided into pleasure and pain, right and wrong, inner and outer. To see the universe as it is, you must step beyond the net. It is not hard to do so, for the net is full of holes. The Apollonian and the Dionysian. To further explore the geography of constructed reality, it is useful to understand and adopt two terms made famous by Nietzsche, Apollonian and Dionysian. According to Nietzsche, every culture requires two principles to flourish. The Apollonian, which embodies the ordered, lawful, solid, cognitive, and stable, and the Dionysian, which embodies the spontaneous, fluid, adaptable, passionate, and creative. In constructed reality, Apollonian forces promote stability and the sense that constructions are real. Dionysian forces promote fluidity, change, and the sense that anything is possible. Recognizing the overt and subtle presence of the Apollonian is necessary to become awake and stay awake. Apollonian change. Apollonian change is incremental and gradual change. It is predictable and expected. It makes one better but not different. Exposure therapy, response prevention, disputing irrational thoughts, and joining a support group are typical examples of Apollonian change. Apollonian change often needs to be maintained. Continuing to work on assertiveness or ongoing sobriety is Apollonian change. It is often hard, takes discipline, requires perseverance. Believing in techniques and practicing them is inversely correlated with Dionysian change. Techniques by definition are always Apollonian because they obey laws and are characterized and limited by expected results. Apollonian change tends to be owned by the institutions of power. As Foucault and narrative therapy argue, Apollonian change may improve client symptoms, but the client continues to have their identity defined by psychiatric institutions. Apollonian change occurs inside the net and is contained by the existing structure of the net. Dionysian change. Secular consciousness occurs within the net. Altered states occur as one leaps outside the bonds of the net. Hypnosis, psychedelic therapies, trauma, an emotional shock, a conversion experience, an epiphany are all examples of altered states. Altered states are closely linked to Dionysian change. Apollonian change supports the extant net. Trauma tears the net. Dionysian change leaps from one place to another discontinuously. It is the wormhole version of psychological change. After the leap, the net is required to repair, rebuild, evolve. Altered states require a brief sojourn outside the bounds of the nomological net. Secular change occurs inside the bounds of the net. Altered state change obeys magical rules. Because of the altered state, identity and reality are permitted to make sudden shifts that are not allowed in secular space. Kill the Buddha stories are teaching stories that attempt to operationalize the difference between Apollonian and Dionysian change. Cultural expectations. Altered state experiences implicitly carry the hope for meaningful discontinuous change. Normal rules of slow, hard change are suspended. The expectation is that quick, profound, transformative change is the norm. This is an archetypal experience in that it crosses cultures. All cultures have implicit or explicit typology of change, Apollonian and Dionysian. standard secular change, and magical spiritual change. After the abilities to deprogram, deconstruct, and seeing reality as fluid, the next most important definition of a constructionist is that they understand and can use Dynasian change. Frank Fairley case. A young woman was referred for therapy who had a variety of problems in both task performance and relationship areas. She was gradually able to achieve much better in her work, but still continued not to date. She finally confessed with some embarrassment that when she was a young girl and her breast began to develop, she went to her mother and told her about her problem. The problem was that though her right breast fitted her bra, her left breast rattled around like a goober pea in a fuel oil barrel. Her mother took her to her family physician, who took the bra off the frightened young adolescent, looked first at one breast and then the other, and issued this dictum: "This is not an uncommon phenomenon." She was then told to dress and return home. Horror-struck, she felt she had a combination of leprosy, polio, and various venereal diseases. When she began to date boys, she immediately ran into the problem about their wanting to pet. Her response was simply to avoid the situation, and as a result, she usually had only 1 or 2 dates with each boy. Therapist: "You mean you're embarrassed and ashamed for them to find out that you got that weird left tit?" Client, embarrassed and hanging her head: "I don't like the way you put it, but yeah, that's about it." Therapist: "So that's why you've been avoiding half the human race." Well, hell, now I think of it, your behavior makes sense. Because if you were to go out on dates with guys, guys being guys would naturally want to pet and get all they could off of you. And once they got your blouse open, there could only be 3 possible reactions that a fellow could have towards you. Client: "Curious but embarrassed. What are they?" Therapist, very seriously: "Well, one reaction would be that he would hastily button up your blouse and say in an embarrassed manner, 'I'm sorry, I didn't know you were a Crip.' A second reaction might be that he would get all heated up and say, 'Whoopee, I've always wanted to do it to a Crip.' And the only other possible reaction that a guy could have would be that once he had unbuttoned your blouse, he would stare at your weird left tit and exclaim, 'Hold it right there, will you? Let me get my Polaroid swinger. The guys back at the frat house will never believe it when I tell them.'" The patient stared at me throughout this and finally with a weak grin stated, "Yeah, that's what I feel would happen, but I'll never really find out if I just sit here and talk and talk and talk about it with you." I got anxious at this point and told her that time was up and that we'd have to discuss it further the next time. As she was about to leave, I remarked, "I like to name my interviews, so I thought I would call this the Weird Left Tit Interview." She laughed and said, "That sounds like an appropriate title for it." The next interview, she came in looking like the cat that had swallowed the 400-pound canary. I greeted her with, "Well, gorgeous, what the hell have you been up to since I saw you last?" Quite briefly, she explained that she had gone out and with much fear and trepidation had hustled a guy and had gone up to his apartment with him. They had shed their clothes and while in their birthday suits were having fun and games. Right in the middle of the proceedings, she called his attention to the fact that her left breast was smaller than her right one. His response was to look at one and then the other and give a client-centered response. "Oh yeah? You feel that it is, huh?" And immediately resumed his activities. She felt like an immense 8-year-old lead weight had suddenly been lifted from her shoulders, and she experienced a marked sense of relief at his acceptance of her. Altered state change. The first criteria for Dionysian change is to enter an altered state. An altered state exists when the strands of the net that stabilize identity are temporarily severed. The individual in this state is confused, disoriented, and bereft of their normal stability. They may be exhilarated, as in certain drug experiences, or frightened. The important point is that they are destabilized. If they receive a suggestion from a trusted and respected figure, at that moment they are likely to go along with the suggestion. They have no normal defenses. However, if the person is not trusted, they will tend to stubbornly resist. Similarly, there needs to be some level of recognition that the new suggestion has the capacity to embody positive change. Put another way, the suggestion has to resonate with the client's inner truth or personal path. Fairley Debriefing. The title of Fairley's book is Provocative Therapy. It seems clear that Fairley attempts to create an altered state and Dynasian change in his clients in most of his interventions. He achieves these states via violating social norms, with verbals and nonverbals that are outside of generally accepted conduct. Manners are the essence of Apollonian dialogue. Violating manners, particularly by a high-status mental health professional, is so unusual that the client had to choose: leave the room with the idea that Fairley was crazy, or enter an altered state. Note that Fairley's induction of an altered state is very different than the kind of formal induction seen in hypnosis or EMDR, but he is attempting to confuse, disorient, and shake up the client's hold on reality, just as intentionally as a therapist who is using psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy. Using the altered states model explicated on the previous slide, Fairley created the altered state by violating norms. The client showed clear signs of being disoriented, confused, and unmoored. He was a trusted and respected figure, partly by being a licensed mental health professional, but mostly because he conveyed non-verbally that he cared and he was an expert. Finally, the recitation of 3 things that might happen were a paradoxical suggestion that they were unlikely to happen and that something else unexpected would occur. Stephen Levine case. In a workshop some years ago, during a grief exploration focused on distrust and fear, a fellow stood in the back of the room and walked hesitantly down the aisle toward the podium. He was growling that this was not the world we could trust. His footsteps were heavy and his tone very frightened and angry. As he approached the front of the room, one could sense a rising fear in some of the participants who viewed this person as something of a madman and a danger. The group belly had tightened. Swinging his head from side to side as if expecting an ambush, his frightened heart screamed, "You can't trust the world. It's out to get you. You've got to be ready to fight." As he approached closely enough for our eyes to meet, I said to him, "I'm glad you came here. This is a good place to work. You know, you're like someone wearing a bulletproof vest." Stopping, he pulled up his sweater. "I'm not like someone with a bulletproof vest. I am someone with a bulletproof vest." Beneath his shirt was displayed the shiny gray dacron of his trembling heart's defenses. "But," he asked me, "what am I to do about armor-piercing bullets?" To let his guard down would have been, for him, to step off the edge of the flat world. There was no safety anywhere. He was terrified Narcissus, seeking to protect the armoring of the heart from being penetrated. It was clear that only kindness would do. Anything rational I might have said would have just fed into the well-established paranoia of his grief. Calling for a bathroom break for the workshop, I walked a dozen feet to where this fellow stood, shaking. As I went to put my arms around him, he stiffened. But when I whispered, "The arms of the mother are always around you. All you need to do is put your head on her shoulder," he began to sob. His armoring broke and his enormous heart exposed itself. He was the personification of our grief, sequestered layer by layer over the heart. He was all the parts of ourselves we have armored ourselves against. His bulletproof vest was a cast for his broken heart. He was the wounded angel of us all. Levine debriefing. Clearly, the client had entered an altered state. Levine's material had challenged his assumptions meaningfully. More importantly, when he chose to make his concerns public by objecting in the midst of the workshop with all gazes upon him, his entry into a full altered state, where he had severed his normal ties to identity, was complete. The client's initial resistance to trusting Levine was apparent in his stiffening, but Levine's words and hug, and most importantly, Levine's readiness to move toward the man's fear and anger, cemented Levine's role as a trusted and respected helper. Finally, the simple suggestion that he become open to trusting the world had significant resonance for the man. He recognized this suggestion as something that fit some form of his inner truth. Radical wisdom and radical connection. The simplest definition of the common factors is a relationship with a wise and caring therapist. These two dimensions, knowledge and connection, are the two disorganizing principles used by Fairley and Levine. Fairley attacked what his client knew to be true, how to act, and Levine disoriented his client by experientially immersing him in an environment of caring and connection, an environment that radically challenged the bulletproof man. The ability to create altered states is as available to the charismatic, wise therapist and to the charismatically compassionate, connected therapist. The radical heart is as disorienting as the radical wisdom. Karl Whitaker. Whitaker specialized in creating altered states in both individuals and families, and managed to create these states in unconventional and unpredictable ways. Rich Simon writes, as Lynn Hoffman put it in her book, Foundations of Family Therapy, Whitaker specializes in pushing the unthinkable to the edge of the unimaginable. During his long career, he has outraged and fascinated the world of therapy with his belief that what he calls craziness, the inner world of fantasy and unsocialized impulse, is a source of creativity and selfhood to be resolutely defended against civilization's abnormal normality. Guided by an unrelenting confidence in his own craziness, Whitaker has challenged all the rules of conventions of therapy. At various stages of his career, he has bottle-fed his patients, arm wrestled with them, refused to allow them to talk, even fallen asleep on them. Problems with altered states. The obvious problem with Dynasian change is that when the client returns to their normal environment, many or even all of the factors there act to restabilize the client into their pre-change state. Certainly some people and environments may welcome and support positive change, but the prevailing response is to recreate old behaviors and attitudes. This, of course, leads to a regression into the previous problematic condition. The behavioral genetic research cautions us that sustainable change requires healthy structure. These two homeostatic factors highlight the importance of the constructionist therapist, always considering structural factors, especially when it comes to sustaining Dionysian change. Altered states, fear and fascination. It is natural for therapists and humans in general to be suspicious of altered states. They are always threatening to the advocates of the Apollonian, and as narrative therapy points out, mental health has been institutionalized and is owned by Apollonians. This unease is common when one goes out beyond the borders. Here be dragons was often written at the edge of the early maps, marking terra incognita. But the Dionysian also has its own attraction, particularly for therapists who intuit that rapid change is most easily accessed at the boundaries. People change when all their stabilizing influences are removed. Early in his career, Frank Fairley was part of Carl Rogers' team developing client-centered therapy. As one might imagine, those therapists were enjoined to let the clients take the lead and to remember that their job was to assist the clients in finding their own way. Fairley, who intuited that he had a different path connected to altered states and radical change, responded, I'm sick and tired of trying to be a horticulturist or a midwife. I'm not any good in either role. What I want to do is pry apart these people's shells, penetrate through to their core, and inject some life into them. Dionysian Change and the 45%. Dionysian Change is effective with the 55% of adaptive changers as well as the 45% of challenging clients. Not surprisingly, the 55% find it easier to enter altered states. What is important to realize is that the 45% are essentially immune to Apollonian change. Put another way, their identities, through trial and error, have become resistant to most Apollonian strategies. They are hyperstable. The exceptions to this rule are discussed in the next video on structure. This suggests that when one wishes to be an above-average therapist, one must become comfortable with inducing and working with altered states. Beyond techniques. Altered states are not a technique. They are a state of consciousness that marks one relationship to the net. Am I inside the net with all the strands well attached? Or am I outside the net, disoriented, experiencing identity loss, and implicitly prepared for a significant change? To work with altered states consciously, a therapist must have an effective map defining secular and sacred space, normal and altered states. Recognizing the boundary and the usefulness of the state is much more important than studying formal techniques. For example, hypnosis, sustained meditation, drugs that are renowned for changing consciousness. As the Kill the Buddha stories teach, confusing outer techniques with the goal leads to disappointment. That said, each therapist that wishes to succeed with the 45% needs to become comfortable with facilitating altered states. Contrasting Fairley, Levine, and Whitaker shows that there are not well-trodden paths to altered states. Rather, there is a dialogue between therapist and client about how to get there. Finally, this focus on the boundaries of the net helps the therapist understand constructed reality from another perspective. This not only facilitates one relationship to change, in the long run, it contributes to an enhancement of therapist charisma.